Welcome to the parallel session number 10.2 of the annual scientific meeting of the Philippine-American Academy of Science and Engineering, or PAASE. I'm your host, Pros Naval from the Department of Computer Science, University of the Philippines, Diliman. Our session theme is Artificial Intelligence and Ethics. Artificial intelligence is the ability of machines to mimic human cognitive functions, such as learning, reasoning, planning, and action. As we know, AI is no longer science fiction stuff. It has made great strides far larger than initially imagined, even by its practitioners. Today, we hear about new and exciting applications of AI, from face recognition systems to chatbots, medical diagnosis systems, to drones and self driving cars. But as AI technologies become increasingly common, more and more people are becoming aware of the ethical issues that surround these applications. For example, when researchers develop technologies in the laboratory, they are designed to be used for the benefit of humankind. However, these same technologies can be used by people with evil intent to do harm. Another ethical dilemma arises from the unintended consequences of artificial intelligence. AI is not the same as human intelligence and may not necessarily share our values. The possibility of it acting against us cannot be ruled out. So these are just some of the issues we need to grapple with. In these session, our first three speakers will delve on similar ethical issues brought about by the advances of AI technologies. And the next three speakers will tackle applications that directly benefit our Philippine society today. So our first speaker for this session is a professor at the Department of Information Systems and Computer Science of the Ateneo de Manila University. Her areas of specialization are educational technology, intelligent tutoring systems, and effective computing. In 2011, she established the Ateneo Laboratory for Learning Sciences. She currently serves as the executive director of Arete, Ateneo's hub for innovation and creativity. She will talk about artificial intelligence in education, ethical considerations. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Maria Mercedes Rodrigo.
Hello, good morning. Thank you very much, Pros, for the introduction. Um, I just wanted to check if my screen was visible.
Yes, we can see the screen.
Okay, thank you. All right. I wanted to talk to you today about artificial intelligence in education and the ethical considerations that surround these applications. And I wanted to begin with a personal story. I work with a researcher slash academic named Ryan Baker, and he is based in the University of Pennsylvania. I met Dr. Baker in 2006 during the Intelligent Tutoring Systems Conference in Taiwan, and he was doing work on gaming the system, how to automatically detect if a student was misusing an intelligent tutoring system in algebra. I'm sorry, in mathematics. It's basically it was a tutor that taught students how to create and interpret scatter plots, and he made essentially an artificial learning companion that would detect if students were abusing the help system or else systematically guessing. And these behaviors were categorized as gaming the system. These behaviors were detrimental because if students engaged with them quite often, then they didn't actually learn from the tutoring system. They could get past all the activities and all the quizzes and questions, but they wouldn't actually emerge from the session with the ITS. 2006, he was studying gaming the system, which was student misuse of tutoring systems, so that they could advance through the curriculum without actually learning anything. And they would do that by either systematically guessing or by abusing the help feature of tutoring systems so that they could get to the answers without actually figuring out what the answers were. And after that initial meeting, Dr. Baker and I started working on affect and learning. And what we would study is how students would behave. So we would look at whether they were on task or off task, working collaboratively, or just totally disengaged and inactive. We would also look at student affective states, like we would look at whether they were confused or bored or delighted or surprised. And the approach that I used when we were conducting these studies was I would use a replication approach. So I would take existing software. The software that you see on screen is an algebra tutor called A+6. It was actually developed in France, and it asks students to solve algebraic problems step by step. So you are given an initial problem, the first line that you see, and then and you can just keep sort of solving the problem a little bit at a time, and until you find yourself the most simple or the simplified solution. Now, what we would do is we would deploy something that was existing already here in the Philippines, and then we'd try to follow the same data collection methodology that that was used to collect data in other studies abroad. Now, why did I choose to use replication studies rather than come up with something on my own? The first reason was that of practicality. One was because at the time, I really didn't have the resources to build new software from scratch. And as the people in this group know, building software is a time-consuming and very expensive process. So if you were to build, especially something that's AI-heavy, to build an AI-heavy application from zero, from the ground, could take years. So I wanted to use something that was existing already to sort of short circuit that process. Also, because the methods had already been established and validated, again, that was one less thing that I had to worry about. I didn't have um, to derive a new methodology, and I didn't have to look for instrumentation like questionnaires and so on, because all I had to do was just copy what had already been done. There was still a contribution. That much I knew, because the data set was from a population. The data set that we collected was from a population that was previously underrepresented and actually continues to be underrepresented. Most of the data that comes that is used to train AI in these tutoring systems comes from weird countries, and I'm not trying to be derogatory here. WEIRD is an acronym that stands for Western Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. And essentially, most of the data came from either the US or Europe. And this isn't because they are trying to be exclusionary. There are many reasons for this phenomenon. First of all, there's much more funding for this type of research in the West. Also, there's the use of English as sort of lingua franca for many of these tutoring systems, and there are many other explanations. So it's an artifact of circumstance and history that the data sets that we have are what they are. But of course, because the data sets come from a particular culture and a particular type of um, a particular group, no, um, they have their own, they carry with them their own biases. So the models that were developed from these data sets are used to inform educational interventions, and as a consequence, these interventions will behave in a certain way. What you're seeing on the screen is the intervention that Dr. Baker came up with. The name of the dog is Scooter, and he was created to detect if students were gaming the system or not. If the students were using the system well, then Scooter is very happy. So Scooter gives the thumbs up, wags his tail, and so on. But if Scooter notices that the students are misbehaving or not using the tutoring system properly or abusing the help system and so on, then Scooter gets mad. Scooter gets all red and he starts growling. And this was somewhat effective in the venues where this was where the system was initially deployed, which was U.S. schools. But and U.S. students tended to dislike Scooter. If anything, they would sometimes misbehave on purpose in order to annoy Scooter. There were reactions like that. But when we deployed in the Philippines, we found out that students actually responded to Scooter very differently. They liked Scooter. They believed that Scooter was friendly, respected their feelings, treated them as individuals, cared about them, wanted them to succeed. So there was a very different reaction to exactly the same intervention. We did a succeeding study on the help-seeking behavior using the same data set. We conducted a study on the help-seeking behavior of students, and we tried to compare data. So remember, the data was collected using the same intelligent tutoring system and using the same data collection protocol. We had data from the US, from Costa Rica, and the Philippines. And what we noticed was the help-seeking behavior, how students chose to get help, varied from country to country. Costa Rican students tended to work more collaboratively for extended periods of time. The U.S. and the Philippine models were more similar, meaning students tended to work more independently. There wasn't as much collaboration, and they tended to use the system features for help rather than the Costa Rican students who tended to ask each other for help. Okay. And so you can see that even in a small situation like this, where interventions are not very very dramatic, there are differences to the way students respond. And I'm one of the people who believes that AI has a tremendous potential to help us in our educational systems. Those of us in the developing world have educational systems that are overstretched and under-resourced, uh, and so there is tremendous potential for AI to help our already strained teaching force. I mean, I do see that, and of course, I also see the limitations. Because we are under-resourced, our schools don't have enough computers, our schools don't have enough internet connectivity, and so even if the potential is there, we cannot maximize it because to do so requires resources in itself. So parang there's a little, there are challenges on all sides. But at the same time, because the interventions are created with particular, or bootstrapped with particular data sets, there it does raise these questions of fate. So this is fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics. And it's only relatively recently that fate in AI in education has been opened up as a conversation. There was a call for papers for the International Journal of Artificial Intelligence in Education. They are putting together a special issue. The deadline has passed. The deadline was last April. I'm not sure if it was affected at all by the deadline was affected at all by COVID, but the last time I checked, which was prior to while I was preparing this talk, the deadline was still sometime April, so it's over already. Pero the point is that they were inspired to call for papers for this special issue because they wanted to open up this conversation about faith in our area. Um, there are many reasons why faith matters in AI ed. I mentioned already that data sets have limited diversity. So just using Scooter um, as an example, and take note, Scooter is very old. Scooter's I think 15 years old by now. Um, and because of that, because of the limited data set that Scooter was trained on, what Scooter could detect and how Scooter could respond was also limited. I also wanted to point out that there was a documentary film entitled Coded Bias that was just released this year. And it starts off with an MIT computer science researcher named Joy Buolamwini. She talks about how facial recognition software, for example, is not able to detect faces of people of color because the training sets that were used to train these facial recognition applications were consisted mainly of Caucasians. So in her case, because she's a person of color, she has to put on a white mask for the application to be able to see that she has a face. Also, the biases in our data sets, even in language, can be codified. And I'm sure this is something that you have seen before. If you use Google Translate, you try translating siya ay doktor, it translates as he is a doctor. If you try to translate siya ay nurse, this translates to she is a nurse. And yet Filipino is a gender neutral language. We have gender neutral pronouns. And so I took the screenshot again as I was preparing for this talk because I had tried it many months ago, and I was hoping that it had been addressed or corrected, but it hasn't yet. So these things, these sort of gender biases find their way into our models. Doctors are men, nurses are women, and yet we know for a fact that this isn't true, right? Okay. Models also depend heavily on correlation. They Because most of the phenomenon that we're interested in modeling cannot be directly measured, we have to settle for proxy indicators, and then there's logic to it. If you're looking at let's say student confusion, in my case, uh, confusion is a very nebulous issue, the nebulous phenomenon. So you don't measure confusion directly, but rather you look at indicators that might imply confusion, like the number of times you look for help, or the number of times you make mistakes, the number of times you attempt a problem and get it wrong, or attempt similar problems and get it wrong, things like that. Or for example, if you're measuring boredom's even harder to detect. You can look at maybe what students are typing. I've had students working on math software that have typed things like Christine, or Christine plus Cyril, or something like that. You know, they start typing out names of their friends, or sometimes they'll type iyak na ako, or something like that, which has nothing to do with math, but it might indicate some kind of other affective state. Um, okay, and the other because we depend highly on correlation, this actually has an effect on um, it opens up our models to being gamed. So, for example, everybody here loves world rankings, right? um, the, a long time ago, U.S. News started world rankings, sorry, rankings of U.S. schools, and they used things like SAT scores, selectivity, promotion rates, and so on. And that created this model, which universities now uh, had to sort of decompose and figure out. And so they would they would, for example, spend a lot on their athletics teams, because spending a lot on athletics teams and winning in athletic competitions would drum up alumni contributions, which then would affect their rankings. So you'd have these systems like that, and these types of sort of feedback loops that actually become quite negative in the end are discussed in a book entitled Weapons of Math Destruction by Kathy O'Neill. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. It's actually quite engaging. Okay. So models are opaque, they're black boxes. There's no way to tell whether how a decision was made or how inputs were weighted. Back in the day when we used to just use linear regressions or decision trees, we could still kind of make sense of the model. But now with deep learning, it's actually much harder to do so. And I know I'm running out of time, so I will speed myself up a little bit. Um, the so one example of an opaque model was this value added model that was used in the US to rate teachers. You might have heard about it already. The teacher performance was rated based on students' performance on standardized tests. However, if you had very high performing students to begin with, then the opportunity to improve is actually very small. And the models read that or interpreted that to be that the teacher was inefficient or ineffective. And so the teachers were penalized for that. And this resulted into lawsuits, some of which the teachers actually won. So courts ruled in favor of the teachers because they found the models arbitrary and capricious. Okay. Um, Applications can be controlling and manipulative. They can nudge people in real time, and children in particular might be particularly susceptible. There's so Nobel Prize winner Richard Thayer has a book entitled Nudge, which is about how to appeal to nuances of the human mind to persuade them to do things, to do good things. But this can be carried quite far. In 2019, the Wall Street Journal came out with a video about how children in a school in China were using these EEG headbands that would help teachers track whether they were concentrating or not. And there was an uproar when this video was released because the students, on the one hand, teachers were saying that it helped students concentrate more and students studied harder, but the data was sent to teachers and to their parents in real time. And so some students were saying that their parents would actually punish them for not concentrating hard enough throughout the day. And so this created a very sort of oppressive kind of police state in the classroom. After this story broke, the use of the headbands was discontinued, and I haven't read an update at since, but this just happened like last year. Okay, I the impact of these models can be quite broad, and I mentioned already weapons of math destruction. This led to the U.S. News rankings in particular led to a kind of rat race uh, where schools would actually falsify data. It led to things like tuition fee increases because actually tuition fees were not part of the model. So you could actually raise tuition fees continuously so that you could spend um, on things that did affect the model. Um, and then, according to the book of O'Neill, this led to the extinction of the quote-unquote safety school. So, if you were a student, you would usually apply to your your moonshot schools, your most probable schools, and then your safety schools. Like, if you didn't make it to your moonshot school and you didn't make it to your desired school, then you at least would have some place to go. But the safety schools also tried to play this game, and so they started actually rejecting qualified students just to affect their the one of the metrics that was incorporated in this model. So how selective they were. Um, so you end up with systems that actually become quite hostile towards students. Then there are many things that we cannot measure yet using the models that we have, things like emotional intelligence, social intelligence, common sense. Um, okay. Then finally, and this is really the last thought I wanted to share, the models that we use reflect the values of those who control them. The whatever models we create are controlled by an agenda. There's always an agenda behind them, and we've all heard of the massive experiment that Facebook conducted back in 2012. It was published in 2014 about how they tried to determine whether emotional contagion was transmittable through social networks. And basically, they found that yes, it was. And fast forward to 2016 and the present day, there was Cambridge Analytica came into headlines in 2016 because of their involvement in the U.S. elections, and there have been allegations that um, they were also involved in Brexit, and they were possibly involved in our own elections here, but we don't really know. Um, and so we have to ask ourselves, like, what motivates the deployment of AI-based applications in schools? Are we motivated by learning, or are we motivated by profit? One of the concerns that this community has, which we have to continue talking about, is that whatever AI-based applications we have, they have to be grounded on solid educational theory, and they have to be tested for effectiveness. But if there is a for-profit agenda behind them, then those things might be set aside. So the conversations are only starting now, but because we are dealing with children and their futures, it's important to keep talking. And this is where I will end. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Didith, for that very interesting and very informative talk on ethical issues in artificial intelligence and education. So I'm sure many of us have questions on the cultural, gender, and other issues on the use of AI tutoring systems, for example, which could be manipulative and nudge us in certain directions. Again, we will have to postpone answering these questions for later. In the meantime, just type your questions for Dr. Rodrigo in the chat box below, which I will read out later for her to answer during the Q&A session or section of this session.